In this recording, we'll be looking at blood through the microscope. Before we get started, I really want you to look on page 289 in your lab book. This is in exercise 37 on the blood. All right, in this lab book, you see lots of examples of micrographs of the individual white blood cells. All right, before we start looking at those individually, I'd like to look at just blood overall. And I like this picture because if you look, let me put some arrows on the cells I want you to see. This is actually a picture that would come from showing the development of cells in the bone marrow that become the blood cells. And you'll learn all about that in your lecture class. In lab, we're just going to focus on what the individual cells look like in the blood. All right, what I've just put an arrow on, of course, would be the red blood cell known as an erythrocyte. Notice it does not have a nucleus. It has one earlier in its development in the bone marrow, but it loses it before it gets out into the cytoplasm. All right, the second, excuse me, this is showing the platelets. Platelets are cytoplasmic fragments of cells that get out in the bloodstream. In lecture, you'll learn what they do. So on various slides today, we'll see platelets as we look at the blood. All right, then these next cells are various white blood cells. Notice these three that are bracketed together. This would be on the one I'm putting an arrow on right now. This would be a neutrophil. Notice that it has a lobed nucleus, L-O-B-E-D, a highly lobed nucleus. And then it has cytoplasmic granules, but they don't have a real distinct color. I know on this picture they look somewhat purple, but they really don't stain up very well. They have a neutral pH, the granules do. That's why they're called neutrophils, and that's why they don't pick up much color with the stain that's used for blood slides. Of these three, the neutrophils, then the one I've got 4 arrows on, this is a basophil. Basophils have granules that are are alkaline or basic. That's why they're called basophils. But these stains that are used stain those basic granules a bluish color. In fact, a pretty dark blue. It almost looks black under the microscope. So those are basophils. They also may have a lobed nucleus. And then the one on the right with the red dots on it that has 1 arrow at this moment, the one with 1 arrow, that one is an eosinophil. Again, it has a lobed nucleus, but it has acidic granules, and they stain a red color. So the neutrophils, basophils, and eosinophils together, all 3 of those in your lecture, you are learning that those are granulocytes because they do have distinct granules in their cytoplasm. Okay, I will erase all of these arrows. Let's move to the next white blood cell. This white blood cell is called a monocyte. It's by far the largest of the white blood cells. It has somewhat of a bean-shaped nucleus or bilobed, but it could be even bean-shaped or U-shaped. And then it has a good bit of cytoplasm that stains somewhat of a bluish color. So you see that. That's by far the largest of the white blood cells. Okay, now these last 2 are both lymphocytes. There's different kinds of lymphocytes that you will study in lecture when you get to the lymphatic system. For lab today, in this exercise, we're not going to distinguish between the 2 different kinds. You really can't tell them apart by just looking at them in the views that we see. But we do need to know that they're lymphocytes. Like the monocytes, they do not have distinct granules in their cytoplasm. That's why, like the monocytes, they're called agranulocytes. They have a large nucleus compared to the whole size of the cell. In fact, up most of the room of the cell, if you even see cytoplasm, you're going to see just a little rim of blue cytoplasm like you see right here, kind of a light blue cytoplasm. Same color that you see over here on the monocytes. All right, these 2 cells that you see down at the bottom here and here, these are blood cells that migrate out into the tissue. The one on the left that I'll put an arrow on you don't have to know this for this exercise, but this is for just for information. This is a macrophage. You may have heard of macrophages. They're some of your body's major phagocytes. They come from monocytes that get out of the bloodstream and out into your tissues. And then this one on the right is a mast cell, and that excuse me, I'm sorry, that is not a mast cell. That's a cell that's actively secreting antibodies. It comes from the lymphocytes. It's called a plasma cell. All right, don't worry about macrophages or plasma cells for your lab for exercise 37. We're just going to look at the various blood cells under the microscope. The red cells, we'll look at the platelets, which aren't whole cells, but they are formed elements in the blood, so we'll see those. And then we will see the 5 different kinds of white blood cells. We will see neutrophils, basophils, eosinophils, monocytes, and then these last 2 together are the lymphocytes. Now, in your lab book, if you will look on page 288 at table 37.2, there you can see what's called a differential white blood cell count. And in that, this is a table that's showing the normal values. So just for normal blood, when someone is not sick, you would see the percentage that the neutrophils would have of all the white blood cells. So you can see the neutrophil percentages ranges from 54 to 62% of the white blood cells. So over half of your white blood cells are neutrophils. If you were to look at a blood slide through the microscope, you would actually get tired of seeing neutrophils. They are so abundant as you're trying to count the different white blood cells. The lymphocytes are almost as abundant. They're a fourth to a third of all of the white blood cells. The monocytes are not nearly as abundant, 3 to 9%. Eosinophils are only 1 to 3%. So I always get really excited when I see an eosinophil. Not only are they very pretty, they're the prettiest of the white blood cells through the scope, but they also are not nearly as abundant as the others. And then the basophils, I get really excited when I find a basophil because they are less than 1% of the white blood cells. So even if you were to find 100 white blood cells, you may not even see a basophil or an eosinophil. On the right-hand side of that same table, table 37.2, you can see what neutrophils fight. So all of these white blood cells aid you in body defense and some in immunity. The neutrophils help to fight bacterial infections. Their levels get elevated during stress. The lymphocytes, you can see that they help to fight viral infections. They produce antibodies. So monocytes, you can see that they help to fight fungal infections. They actually are some of the major phagocytes of the body. And the eosinophils and basophils, you can see what they might fight. So if you were suffering from some disease and the lab performed what's called a differential white blood cell count, what they're going to do is look at your blood slides made from your blood and literally count the white blood cells, and they'll try to go and count 100 and do at least 100 and do a percentage, figure out how many of those are neutrophils, how many are basophils, how many are eosinophils. Once they figure out the number of each, then they can determine the percentage, and then if the percentages are not within the normal values, they can better determine what type of infection you're trying to count to fight. So if you were having an allergic reaction, you can see on that table your eosinophil count is going to be higher than 3%. If you were fighting a bacterial infection, your neutrophil count would be elevated. Or if you're under stress, your neutrophil count would be elevated. So this would give you give the physician an indication of what you're fighting, so he would know what drugs to prescribe and how to further treat you. Our goal for this lab exercise is simply to look at individual white blood cells and determine what type they are. Okay, so if we'll move, this first micrograph that you're seeing is blood on the scanning power. So that's not magnified very much. You can see lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of tiny, tiny, tiny little pink dots. Those are your erythrocytes or red blood cells. And then scattered amongst those, you see these little purple dots. All right, the purple is usually the nucleus of a white blood cell. So we're seeing several white blood cells, but they're not nearly as numerous as the red blood cells. And you cannot tell what a white blood cell is or what type it is unless you put it on a higher power. So this next slide is zooming in just a little bit more. Now we're on low power. It's still pretty hard to tell what kind of white blood cells we're seeing unless you're really trained in this. You see lots of red blood cells. Look at all these little red blood cells all over the place. And then here and there you see a few white blood cells. If we move to a higher magnification, now we're seeing numerous red blood cells. These are the cells that are anucleated, meaning they don't have a nucleus. But on this slide, I'm seeing 2 white blood cells. All right. In a little while, we may come back to this slide, and you'll identify for me which white blood cells you see. All right, here, this is a much higher power. This is taken with an oil immersion lens, so we're getting a very powerful magnification. On this cell in the center is a white blood cell. It's the most common white blood cell called the neutrophil. It has a highly lobed nucleus, and it has a grainy cytoplasm that doesn't really stain up very well. All right, you can see numerous red blood cells around it. That would be a neutrophil in the middle. All right, here's another slide showing a neutrophil. Again, you can see the various lobes of the nucleus, anywhere from 2 to 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 lobes in that nucleus. Lots of red blood cells around it. This next slide is just with high power, not with the oil immersion lens. And here is a neutrophil. Now that you know what they look like on a higher view, you can tell that this is a neutrophil. Mostly what you're seeing is that lobed nucleus. You can barely see the cytoplasm, and it's just kind of neutrally stained. Here's another view of a neutrophil. You can see the nucleus is so lobed it almost looks like there's more than one nucleus there. They do connect. The lobes do connect. And then the cytoplasm is kind of nondescript. Notice these tiny little purple dots I'm pointing to. Those are some platelets. You're going to see these in several of the slides, tiny little platelets. All right, this next slide, this is on oil immersion. We see there's some platelets, blood cells, and then the cell in the middle that's really obvious. That one has distinct pinkish red granules in the cytoplasm. Now, that's the stained look. It's not going to be that color naturally, but that is an eosinophil. Most of the time, eosinophils have a bilobed nucleus, but all of the time, they have these granules that stain red. Now, this picture comes from your textbook, and the redness doesn't show up quite as much. You do see some platelets over here on either side, but you can see the bilobed nucleus of the eosinophil. On the next slide, we can see another view of the eosinophil, and here the redness of the granules really appears. When I give you pictures like this for your lab quiz or a lab test, I'll try to get some that the granules show up real well for you. It won't be one that would be difficult to identify. Okay, here we have it on a just high power, not oil immersion. And at the bottom right, that would be an eosinophil. And I really like this view because you can compare that eosinophil to the white blood cell at the top, which is a neutrophil. We've already just studied that. So do you see how they look similar in size? They both have a lobed nucleus, but the eosinophil has the reddish stained granules in its cytoplasm, whereas the neutrophil does not. All right, this next slide is the white blood cell that is the least abundant. That would be a basophil. Basophil has the very, very dark staining granules. I also see a couple of platelets there. Do you see? There's a platelet. There's a platelet. Platelets are also called thrombocytes. You'll recall that. All right, look at the basophil. Look at all the little granules. These are cytoplasmic granules. And then you see the nucleus, which is the hazier blue color in there. It is lobed because it's like neutrophils and eosinophils in that it has a lobed nucleus. Here's another view of a basophil. This comes from your textbook. Again, you can see the little dark granules in it. So much so that you hardly even notice the nucleus. If it looks speckly, that's how I tell my students, if it looks dark, speckly, like it's got freckles all over it, that's probably going to be a neutrophil. Excuse me, I said that wrong. If it has freckles all over it, that's going to be a basophil. Okay, this slide is not a great one, but it is showing you in the middle, this is a monocyte. A monocyte is very different from neutrophils, eosinophils, and basophils because it has a bluish stained cytoplasm. It's hard to see that on this view. We'll see some other slides where it, I'm sorry, I have totally told you wrong. This one is a basophil. Excuse me. Please forgive me. We're not to the monocytes yet. All right, this one is a basophil. And as I was talking about it being a monocyte, I thought, well, it has a real grainy cytoplasm, but that's because it is a basophil. See the little dark specks in the cytoplasm? All right, let me erase these arrows so you can see that better. So that is a basophil. Of course, that was easier to identify on the higher view. Let's look at this next slide. This one is the monocyte. It's got, almost always, you'll see a bean, B-E-A-N, bean-shaped nucleus, and then it has bluish stained cytoplasm. Not really distinct granules. I know it looks a little grainy, but nothing like that basophil or eosinophil. This is the largest of the white blood cells. Here's another monocyte. The blueness of the cytoplasm does not show up well, but the largeness of the cell does, and the bean-shaped nucleus does. All right, I like this picture because here you're seeing, if we look at the arrows, that is a neutrophil. To the right is another neutrophil, and right here in the center, that's a basophil. It's a little bit difficult to pick out the nucleus. I'm trying to draw around it, but you can see it's somewhat bean-shaped. And then you can see the blue cytoplasm around it. This cell at the bottom is one we're about to study. That's a lymphocyte. It has more of a rounded nucleus. This is a pretty large lymphocyte. This is probably one that's actively secreting antibodies. But you can see the bluish tinge to the cytoplasm. It's going to have a blue cytoplasm just like the monocyte does. All right, this next slide. This shows a real close-up view of the oil immersion of a lymphocyte. You can see that its nucleus is about the size of a red blood cell, the entire red blood cell. It's the smallest of all the white blood cells. The monocyte is the largest, the lymphocyte is the smallest, and it has a bluish colored cytoplasm like the monocyte does. Not granular cytoplasm, just sort of a smooth blue. Okay, this next slide is showing another lymphocyte. Even though it doesn't look blue in the cytoplasm, you can see the nucleus is just a big old fat round nucleus and just barely a little rim of cytoplasm. We see several platelets here too. This would be another lymphocyte, a little bit larger than some of the others compared to the red blood cells, some of the other lymphocytes, but they're still a lymphocyte because it's got the big round nucleus and just a bare little rim of cytoplasm. Okay, here's another lymphocyte. This is a really good one. Okay, here at the top we see, you tell me, what is that? That's a lymphocyte. What is this one at the bottom? I know it looks like just a smudge, but it's actually a cell there. Notice it's got a big nucleus, kind of bean-shaped, sort of bean-shaped, and it's got a good bit of blue cytoplasm, not a skinny rim of it, but a lot of blue cytoplasm, and it's huge compared to the red blood cells. That would be a monocyte. Now, on this slide, right here in this area, that's just some stain. Just ignore that. Look at this cell. Let me erase the arrows. Look at this cell. What is that? That's a lymphocyte. What is this one? Think. You see a lobed nucleus? Do you see real distinct granules? No, it's just kind of dull looking, isn't it? So that's a neutrophil. Go back and look at some neutrophil slides. And then here's our last slide. You tell me, what's this cell at the top here I'm pointing to? You see the red granules? That's just the giveaway. That's the eosinophil. And then this one on the right, this is a great one. That's a monocyte. Okay. Okay, again, just like I told you for the last exercise on endocrine, you would do an image search for these various white blood cells. You're going to just go to Google and do an image search, or AOL or Yahoo. Any of those search engines can give you some good images to look at, so you can just be really well versed in these slides. Also, I want you to make sure you read all about the differential white blood cell count. I've got an activity online for you to do with the differential white blood cell count. I want you to read the directions very, very carefully and go into that. That'll be a lot of fun for you. I may have some quiz questions on that too. All right, study hard on these cells. Archive recording has